Hi students, so we're going to talk about the microbiome today. I sent you a little link to an introductory video that Dr. St. Clair made about the microbiome, so just go ahead and watch that. It's really fun, it's short. But basically we're talking about, we spent last class talking about bacteria that cause disease, pathogens, but it turns out that most of the bacteria that live in your body and on your body are non-pathogenic. They're actually beneficial. They have mutualistic relationships with us. We've talked about that before too. And so all of that collectively we call your microbiome. So up your nose, in your ears, in your mouth, in other openings, in your intestines. These are all little organisms that help you digest your food. They help you prevent sickness from other pathogens because they compete for the space that other pathogens might want. And they do a lot of things. So we're actually going to look at a bunch of data today and try to draw conclusions about what the microbiome does for us, as well as what affects the microbiome and how we can help keep a healthy microbiome. And it turns out research on the microbiome is really pretty new. It's a newer field. So we're learning more and more each day about the microbiome. But this is a little bit of what we know. So it's super exciting. So we're going to go through the data. And I would love for you to have out your packet pages. There's a whole set of packet pages in your student packet where you can pause the video and you can look at the data yourself and try to draw the conclusions and then check yourself with what I say. That's the best way to learn. I'm not saying you have to do that. You might just skip right through, but if you really want to learn this stuff and you want to practice for what might be on the test, pause, look at the data, see if you can draw the conclusion, and then watch what I say. All right, okay, so let's get started. Okay, so let's take a look at our first set of data. So I'm going to orient you to this graph first, and then you can pause the video. And so this is looking at the microbiome, what species are there and what their abundance is. That's the height of those bar graphs. Don't worry about the types of species. I'm not expecting you to know these. All we're doing is looking at differences between. So the two different bars, one is those babies who were born by cesarean, so an incision in the stomach and they were pulled directly out, versus in red, those who were delivered vaginally, so they went through the birth canal of the mother. And this is when they're first born, and this is at 2 months later. And so a baby is totally sterile in their gut when they're inside the mommy's tummy. And so this is the bacteria they're picking up through the birth process and then through their first 2 months of life. So I want you to pause the video and just see what differences you see. Okay, so let's analyze this. Hopefully you paused and looked. And so what you can see is really the takeaway message is that they are different, right? So we're trying to answer this question, where does your microbiome originally come from? So where do those original bacteria that get into your system, where do they come from in the gut? And so it turns out that it's very different between a cesarean birth and a vaginal birth. So in a vaginal birth, if you look at what the bacteria is, it most resembles the vaginal canal of a human. And if you look at a cesarean birth, it actually more resembles what we find on the skin, because the doctor's pulling you out, you're laying on your mom's skin, and that's where you're getting those bacteria. And you can see that by 2 months, it's starting to spread out and get more diverse and look a little bit more similar, but they are still a little bit different between the two types of births. So that's the first set. Let's look at our second set. All right, so this is a little complicated, but this one here on the left is looking at where they come from, where people come from. And it's a cluster analysis, so don't worry about the specifics of it, but if the dots group together, it means they're more similar to each other. If they don't group together, they're different from each other. And then the second one is looking at 3 different types of babies from 3 months to a year old. So these are formula-fed vaginal births. These are cesarean births of unknown diet, and these are breastfed vaginal births. So I want you to pause the video and look at these 2 graphs. Again, we're trying to answer the question, where does your microbiome come from? Okay, so pause. Okay, so looking at the one on the left, hopefully you could see that if they were from the same general area, they clustered together with each other. So one of the places that we get our microbiome is from our environment, right? And the environment between America versus Canada, Sweden, Brazil, Bangladesh, China are very different. The foods we're exposed to, the bacterial contamination in the environment that we're exposed to, is all different. And so you would expect them to cluster together by region or location. And then in this one, what you should see is that if you look at vaginal births, so the one on the left and the one on the right, that we see differences in the types of species based on whether you're formula fed or breastfed. And you can think about this as the baby is getting introduced to bacteria. If they're breastfed, they're getting introduced to a lot of the bacteria on the skin of the mom. Whereas if they're formula fed, they're getting introduced to the bacteria on the bottle's nipple, from your dishes, that kind of thing. And then cesarean, we know just right from the get-go, if you don't go through the birth canal, you have a slightly different microbiome than if you go through the birth canal. So again, where does our microbiome come from originally? Well, it comes from the way that we're born and what we're fed and where we live. Okay, so that's the second set. I'm gonna pause here for a second and pull up the next set of data. So here's our next set of data, and this next question: can the microbiome affect your health, or is it the other way around? Does your health affect the microbiome? So these data come from 3 different types of people. So 3 people, the NW, are normal weight individuals who are healthy weight. 3 people are people who are classified as obese. And then the third group is gastric bypass. So these are people who are obese, who have opted to do surgery that bypasses a portion of your stomach, designed to help you lose weight. And so we're looking at the microbiome. Again, don't pay attention to the species, just pay attention to differences. So go ahead and pause the video and try to decide or just look at what differences you see based on their body weight. Okay, so if you had a chance to look at this, you'll see, again, just the overall trend is that they look different, right? Normal weight individuals in the clear or the white bars look different than people who are obese. And having the gastric bypass, even though it does cause you to lose weight, it doesn't necessarily shift your microbiome to the same as a healthy weight individual, but you're also not the same as an obese individual. So the question really becomes, is it the bacterium that are the bacteria that are causing you to be obese or not? Or are your eating habits or your obesity causing the bacteria to be a certain way? And it turns out it's actually kind of both, right? So they've looked at this and they've found that the bacteria in your gut actually send signals to your brain that cause you to desire or crave the food that they need to eat. And so if you are overweight and your diet is promoting that, then the bacteria in your system will then have like this positive feedback loop where it will cause you to crave the things that promote their growth. And so interestingly, what they have found, and this is kind of gross, but what they found is that you can take the fecal matter from a normal weight individual, and then you can wipe out the bacteria in an overweight individual, so by massive antibiotics, and then you can do what we call a fecal transplant. And yes, it is as gross as it sounds. They actually encapsulate the fecal material and you swallow it. But what we found is that establishing a new microbiome can actually cause a person to lose weight. But alternatively, if you change your diet so that it's only promoting growth of a healthy microbiome, you can actually change your desires, your cravings, and your weight that way. But it takes a good 6 weeks or so to redo your microbiome for the community to switch. And so if you're going to diet, you have to be on that diet for like 6 weeks before the microbiome changes and it becomes easier because the cravings change. So they're still doing a lot of research on this. It's a new area, but we have found, especially with sick people, that fecal transplants are super effective at changing their microbiome quickly. Okay, so let's look at the next one, again looking at health. So this is, how does your diet directly affect your microbiome? Okay, so here are 2 people's diets. Oh, I meant to change the typo on this. Somewhere there's this weird quesadilla that's spelled wrong that my student made. Anyway, ignore that. But here's 2 people's diets and their associated microbiome. So again, don't worry about species names, but we're looking at variety based on what the diet is. All right, so I want you to pause the video here and analyze the diets and look at the variety. Okay, so hopefully you can see that the more varied the diet, right, the more varied your microbiome. And obviously healthy versus unhealthy foods are also going to cause differences in healthy versus unhealthy species. But really the idea is moderation in all things, right? That you have this variety in your diet, that you buy different things at the store, that you're not always eating the same thing, because it will actually decrease diversity of your microbiome. And diversity in your microbiome is good. We want a diverse set of species in our microbiome for good health. And so things that promote diversity is a diversity of diet, which makes sense, right? If you eat more varied foods, you're going to get more varied microbiomes. And the other thing that affects us is in our next slide. So here's the next set of data, looking at the variation in your environment and how that affects your microbiome. So pictured here are 3 gut profiles from 3 different children, and I'm not going to tell you which is which yet. So Martha lives in a city with no pets. Jayesh lives in a poverty-stricken slum of Mumbai, India, and then Parker lives on a farm in Kansas. So I want you to look, and again, it's kind of, the species don't matter, they're kind of blurry anyway, but you're looking at the variation. Try to decide which child belongs to which microbiome. That's question 1. Then question 2, what conclusion can you draw about the variation of the environment and the development of your microbiome? And then question 3, just hypothesize, who do you think has the strongest immune system? So go ahead and pause the video here and think about that. Okay, so if we're looking at differences, if you were looking at these 3 people, Martha probably has the most homogeneous environment, living in the city with no pets, whereas Jayesh probably has the most varied environment. He's getting exposed to a ton of different bacterial species as he lives in the slums in Mumbai. And Parker's kind of in between. He's on a farm, so he's getting exposed to livestock and lots of bacteria. And so if you're looking here, A is Martha, B is Parker on the farm, and then C is Jayesh. So you see a lot of variety. And so obviously your microbiome is affected by your environment, and the more varied your environment, the more varied your microbiome. And it turns out that the research shows that your microbiome actually helps establish your immune system and how strong your immune system is. And so the more varied your environment, the more varied your microbiome, and the stronger your immune system. So Jayesh probably has the most strong immune system. They've actually done a lot of studies on having pets, and they've found that children who grow up with pets in their home have a more varied microbiome, have a stronger immune system, and have less autoimmune diseases like asthma, allergies, arthritis. And so it actually is beneficial to have a dog or a cat or something growing up. So just remember that when you guys become parents, that your kids should have pets if you can at all stand it and help it. So, all right, so I'm going to pause here and pull up the next set of data. Okay, so these next few graphs look at disturbance. So just like in the environment, if you have like a forest fire come through and wipe out all of the species, you get changes in the species that are alive in that area. And it's the same thing in your microbiome. If you disturb it, different things happen. So this is looking at disturbance. So this first one is kind of a confusing graph, but we're looking at the incidence of C. difficile. So C. diff, this is a life-threatening diarrheal disease that people often catch in the hospital. And these are patients receiving antibiotic treatment. So they sampled a microbiome of 2 groups of patients who had received antibiotic treatment. One group that did not contract C. diff, so this is before antibiotics, after antibiotics, and then one group that did end up getting C. diff. And this is what they look like before antibiotics, after antibiotics. Again, species don't matter, but you're looking for colors to indicate variety. Okay, so there's 2 things you're going to look at. First of all, you're going to look at what is the effect. Oh no, let's first look at differences between those who don't get C. diff and those who do get C. diff. And then I want you to look between the left and the right. What do antibiotics do to the microbiome? Okay, so go ahead and pause it here and think about that. Okay, so let's first look at the difference between this person and this person. So the person on the top who did not contract C. diff versus the person who did contract C. diff. Hopefully you could see that the person who did not contract C. diff had a more varied microbiome to start with. They had more species available, more diversity, and that actually protected them against contracting C. diff. And if you think about it, it would be, like if you have an invasive species coming in, if there are a whole bunch of species that are already taking up all the niches in the environment and using all the resources, it's a lot harder for a new species to find a place to live. But if you don't have very much variety, there's quite possibly niches that are not occupied by someone, and so C. diff can come in. And then obviously going from left to right, you should see that diversity does decrease a bit with antibiotics. Now, depending on how strong the antibiotics are, it can totally wipe out the diversity in your gut. Taking antibiotics can be really hard on your microbiome. It should decrease diversity with antibiotics. So on that note, we'll look at the next set of data to see more about how that affects it. So this is a really cool experiment they did in the laboratory where they took mice, okay? And so the control mice are in the dark filled in, right? And then the mice who were given antibiotics are in the not filled in, okay? And so what they did is they gave mice antibiotics and they looked at what they looked like at the time of giving the antibiotics, 2 weeks later and 7 weeks later. And these axes, it's a little confusing, but it's looking at abundance and diversity, so deviations from abundance and diversity from the controls. So anytime the group of dots moves away from where the controls are, it means that their diversity and abundance has changed. Okay, so I want you to take a look at what conclusions you can draw about using antibiotics and what it does to your abundance and diversity. So pause here. Okay, so if you looked, the obvious conclusion is that antibiotics shift in some way or another, and we don't know from this graph whether it shifts it down or up or whatever, which we know though from the previous graph that giving antibiotics will decrease your diversity and abundance because it's killing them off. But what should be really kind of eye-opening to you is that yes, we get this initial shift, but even after 7 weeks, they do not shift back to where the controls are. Right? So recovering from antibiotics takes a really long time to re-establish that original community that's there. That's why I'm always very leery of, I will take antibiotics when I need it. I'm not anti-antibiotics. I think antibiotics are amazing. But if you don't need them, you shouldn't take them because they mess with your microbiome and it takes longer than 7 weeks to re-establish that microbiome. So let's look at this next one's even more fascinating. So now what they did is they took mice, the blue mice are ones that never received antibiotics. The red mice are ones that did receive antibiotics. Now, mice practice a process called coprophagy, meaning that they eat their own feces and other feces in the cage. And so the scientists thought, well, hey, okay, if we take mice that have received antibiotics and we put them with healthy mice, will that help restore their microbiome to where it should be? And so these are the mice that receive or that did not receive antibiotics. This is our controls. This is a mouse that was healthy that did not receive antibiotics with a mouse who received antibiotics, and then these are 2 mice that received antibiotics being paired together. So I want you to just take a minute and look at this and tell me what happens to mice. Does the healthy mouse rescue the sick mouse, or does the sick mouse drag the healthy mouse down? So pause here and think about that. Okay, so hopefully what you see is that this mouse that originally was healthy, when it's paired with a mouse that's had antibiotics, it actually switches to this unhealthy microbiome community. They're all deviated, right? So it just shows you that these invasive species that come in after taking antibiotics are actually really hardy and really hard to change. So again, that's this idea that if you take antibiotics, especially if you don't need them, you're messing with a community that then gets replaced by a different community and then has a really hard time recovering back to the original community. It takes a long time. That invasive community is often very bad. And so that was really fascinating to scientists that, gee whiz, messing with someone's microbiome can actually be really, really long-lasting and detrimental. Okay, so let's go to this last one, which is just fascinating. So this is looking at mental health. So how in the world do they look at mental health in mice? Because this is in mice. So they measured 2 things in the mice. So obsessive compulsive disorder and anxiety, right? And so what they looked at is for obsessive compulsive disorder, they compared the pups. Let's see, where does it say it? They measured how often they buried a marble. And so this is like a obsessive compulsive behavior. If you put marbles in, the pups will bury them. So the more they bury them, the more they're showing obsessive compulsive behavior. So this one on the right is looking at marble burying, so the percentage of time that they were burying a marble. And then to look at anxiety, they looked at the time it took for the little pup to start crying when the mom was removed, which is kind of sad if you think about it. But the length of time it took them to start crying is an indication of anxiety. If they start crying right away, they're really anxious. If they take a while to start crying, then they're much more confident. And so what they did is they fed the mice this CD, which is the balanced normal chow diet, and then they fed other mice a high fat diet, so a poor diet, which would be like similar to a college student diet if you're eating out of vending machines all the time. And so poor diet versus good diet. And so I want you to look at, so this is poor diet versus good diet in males, poor diet versus good diet in females, and then this is total time it takes for them to start crying when their mom's removed, and this is total amount of time they're spent burying a marble. And so go ahead and pause the video and take a look at this. Okay, so here what you should see, and this is crazy, that if you give the pups a high-fat diet, it makes them more anxious, right? So this lower bar indicates that they start crying faster with less time, okay? And you'll notice also that it affects males more than it affects females. It affects both of them, but males have even a more dramatic effect. Fed a bad diet, they get more anxious. And then this one, if we're looking at the percentage of time that they're burying a marble, you can see that on the high-fat diet, they spend a lot more time doing obsessive-compulsive behaviors. And it affects, again, males and females both, but it affects males way more. So what they found is that feeding the mice the high-fat diet actually changed their microbiome to an unhealthy microbiome, and it affected their mental health. So that's something to think about as you pick out your food each day, that a healthier diet will promote a healthier microbiome, and it actually can be better for your mental health. So pretty amazing. All right, so this last slide just goes through the learning outcomes for this lesson. So I expect you to be able to look at what's affecting the microbiome, where the microbiome is coming from, and what effect the microbiome has on its health. So you can pause the video here and look through these learning outcomes and make sure you understand these. And that is it. So hope you enjoyed this lesson.